So the last couple of days have been kind of a trip down memory lane for me. We went down to Thousand Oaks, just north of Los Angeles, for the ordination of a very dear friend of ours, long time friend of ours, classmate from Cal Lutheran, a roommate of Marielle's at Cal Lutheran, and these are people we've just known and love. Our kids were at Cal Lutheran together in recent years, lots of paths crossing. But one of the things that we always do when we go down to Thousand Oaks is we always, even though the ordination wasn't happening at Cal Lutheran, we always make a point to walk the campus. So see the dorms, see if it's still standing. We walk by the chapel, which is always open, which is great. Marielle and I were one of the first weddings in that chapel after it was constructed, and so it's kind of a fun time, particularly since the cross and the altar and some of the other elements up there were sculpted or carved by Dr. Ernst Schwitter, an art professor at Pacific Lutheran University up in Tacoma, Washington, who did a ton of churches, including one in Palo Alto. And so seeing similar kinds of carvings in that space are always kind of heartwarming. In the story that we have in the gospel, Jesus is embarking on, it's kind of perhaps an odd way to say it, but an adventure, we might say. An adventure to which he does not really seem to know the immediate outcome. We hear this dramatic story, and when I was on campus at Cal Lutheran, I was thinking, yeah, there's a lot of adventures that start in that phase of life, right? There's the start of school. There's the start of a marriage as we move through steps, thinking big dreams and hopes. And then moving on to seminary, where then I had the opportunity to be drafted to an entirely different part of the country that I was unfamiliar with and is really cold, and served for 5 years in Northwest Minnesota. There were a lot of adventures that started in that period of time that I could not necessarily have seen the outcome. In fact, one of the things when we moved to Northwest Minnesota was that Marielle was about 7.5, 8 months pregnant when we moved up there with our son Eli. And things were going along well right until he was born, and they decided then to fly him to Minneapolis, which was the start of another adventure. It was kind of a funny thing. There's only a certain amount of preparing that you can do for things, right? Some adventures start in life without the opportunity to prepare, and those can be particularly scary or exciting depending on what kind of adventure that it is. I remember as we were preparing to welcome Eli into the world, we did a lot of reading. To be fair, Marielle did more than I did, but the great What to Expect When You're Expecting series and all of these books that come out. And one of the last things she read before Eli was born was an article from a publication that was discussing how to find the right pediatrician. So it was entitled Finding Dr. Right. And so you read all this and how to find that doctor and so on and so forth. When Eli was born, it was with a very complicated congenital heart defect. And he was flown down to Minneapolis ahead of us, which was weird to leave the hospital without a child, and then to drive down to a place where Eli already was, which was strange to have a child that was like he was off at college or something, and meeting all the people that he suddenly knew that we did not know. And as we were sitting and waiting for the cardiologist to come and visit us to meet us for the first time, he walked in and he said, "Hey, I'm Dr. Greg Wright." We said, "Of course you are." Of course you are. There are points in our lives where the right person steps in to accompany us. Sometimes those adventures are fabulous ones, exciting ones that we are happy to jump into, even though we maybe don't know all the steps that are coming down the road. But there are other adventures that are not as fun, that are hard, that are very difficult, that might be stories or chapters of death or being close to death, or loss of all kinds of stripes and varieties, relationships, employment, any number of things that might crop up that be adventures where we say, this is not an adventure I would have signed up for if that was an option. I would not have done this, and yet here I am. And in the midst of those, particularly as people of faith, we wonder about those times and those opportunities where that right person comes alongside of us to walk with us, maybe to carry some of the burden for us at times. It's not our ability then to escape the adventure that we've been cast into, perhaps, but to know that we're going on this adventure in a way that's not alone. In the Old Testament reading that we have for today, we hear about a shift in the way that God is going to interact with God's people. We hear about a shift from a time where there would be a lot of book learning and instruction about how we understand and come to know God, that it would be about rules and laws, and that in memorizing these and seeking to follow them as closely as possible, that would draw us near to God. But the text kind of moves in a different direction then. In this adventure, it's not so much a manual, but rather, I'm going to write about my love on your heart. I'm going to write it on your heart. The idea that we would know God in our bones, in our own bodies, that we might know the presence of God, and not just when the adventures are fun. I think that's the important piece of this. At athletic events, we might see people pointing up into heaven or offering thanks to God at a touchdown or whatever the case might be. When there is a celebration, somehow that's an easy piece of the equation, even if it's not something publicly demonstrated. But it's when the way ahead is shadowed in a way that makes it difficult to see. It's when the way forward is painful or suddenly lonelier than we expected, that it's not about a test. It's not about a set of rules that we've been asked to memorize and follow, but rather Christ, who has been to the darkest places, comes to us and says, I will be as near to you as your own heart. We are really getting close to Holy Week now. And we know this story, right? We know the story of how Christ moves into Jerusalem and is crucified and rises from the dead. We know this story, this sequence of things. But I think we often lose track of the fact that this story is not just the story of Christ. By the waters of baptism, the story is our story too. So when we read this morning about Christ and the sense that Christ is not alone in this dark chapter, that is us as well. So as you prepare your hearts to move into this week that is the holiest of the year, be mindful that as we move into the adventures of this life, we do not go alone. We do not go without hope. Even if it is difficult, we know that Christ comes with us. Amen.